In our hyperconnected age, the art of solitude has become almost revolutionary. We live in a society where being alone is often mistaken for being lonely, where silence is filled with notifications, and where our worth seems measured by how busy our social calendars appear. This is the story of Emma, a journey that mirrors countless others who have discovered that running from solitude often leads us further away from ourselves. Emma's relationship with solitude began, as many do, in childhood. Picture a 5-year-old girl on her first day of kindergarten, sitting quietly on a playground bench, content to observe the world around her. In that moment, she wasn't lonely, she was simply being. But then came the well-meaning voice of authority. Why are you sitting alone? Go play with others. It's better than being by yourself. That single interaction planted a seed that would grow into a lifelong anxiety. The message was clear: being alone equals being wrong. From that day forward, Emma learned to equate solitude with failure, isolation with inadequacy. The psychology behind this is profound. Dr. Sherry Turkle, a renowned researcher at MIT, has extensively studied how early experiences shape our relationship with solitude. She notes that when children are consistently redirected away from quiet moments of self-reflection, they often grow up unable to tolerate their own company. As Emma grew, so did her elaborate strategies to avoid being alone. In middle school, she said yes to every invitation, even when the activities didn't align with her interests. She loved running and hiking, finding peace in nature's rhythms, but her friends preferred shopping malls and living rooms. Rather than honoring her authentic preferences, Emma chose the path of least resistance, the path that guaranteed company. This pattern intensified in high school. When her friends began pairing off into romantic relationships, Emma felt the familiar panic of potential isolation. She quickly entered her first relationship with Will, not because of deep connection or compatibility, but because being coupled meant never having to face an empty weekend. The relationship with Will lasted just over a year before he called her too clingy and jealous. Looking back, Emma could see the truth in his words. She hadn't been clingy because she loved him deeply. She had been clinging to the safety net he represented, the barrier between her and the dreaded silence of her own company. What followed was a revolving door of relationships. Kevin, Chris, Paul, each lasting roughly a year or two, each ending in disappointment or betrayal, each followed by only the briefest pause before the next began. Emma had become an expert at relationship maintenance, but remained a stranger to herself. The pattern was always the same. She would meet someone new and feel the immediate relief of companionship. The empty spaces in her calendar would fill with dinner dates and weekend plans. But inevitably, as the initial excitement faded, she would realize that compatibility had taken a backseat to availability. She was choosing partners not for who they were, but for their willingness to occupy her time and space. Dr. John Gottman's research on relationship success emphasizes that the strongest partnerships are built between two people who are comfortable with themselves as individuals. Emma's relationships were doomed from the start because she was using them as a form of emotional outsourcing, expecting others to provide what she couldn't give herself, a sense of wholeness and peace. After her relationship with Paul ended, Emma found herself in uncharted territory. Her friends were increasingly busy with their own lives, careers, marriages, children. The social safety net that had caught her throughout her 20s was no longer there. For the first time since kindergarten, Emma was regularly alone. The weekends stretched endlessly. Her apartment felt cavernous. Every quiet moment was filled with the anxiety she had spent decades avoiding. In desperation, she accepted invitations to events where she barely knew anyone, reached out to friends she had little in common with, and eventually threw herself into another relationship with CJ, the first person who showed interest after Paul. Initially, the relationship with CJ felt different. There was genuine chemistry, shared laughter, and what seemed like real compatibility. But as Dr. Helen Fisher's research on love stages reveals, the intense neurochemical cocktail of early romance inevitably settles into a more realistic assessment of long-term compatibility. When that happened with CJ, Emma discovered that beneath the initial spark, there wasn't enough substance to sustain a healthy partnership. But by then, the thought of returning to solitude felt impossible. She had become so accustomed to defining herself through relationships that she no longer knew who she was outside of them. Emma's marriage to CJ became a masterclass in the dangers of fear-based decision-making. She said yes to his proposal, not because she felt genuinely excited about building a life together, but because she couldn't bear the thought of starting over alone. The marriage itself was a study in quiet desperation. CJ, perhaps sensing Emma's dependence, began to withdraw emotionally. The very thing Emma had feared most, being alone, was happening while she was living with someone else. She was experiencing what psychologists call lonely togetherness, a state that can feel more isolating than actual solitude. When CJ died in a car accident 6 years into their marriage, Emma's initial grief was complicated by an unexpected emotion, relief. This revelation filled her with guilt until her therapist helped her understand that feeling relieved didn't make her a bad person, it made her human. In therapy, Emma began to excavate the layers of fear and avoidance that had shaped her adult life. She realized that her entire identity had been built around being in relationship to others. Without the mirror of companionship, she couldn't see herself clearly. "I don't even really know who I am when I'm not in the reflection of other people," she told her therapist, a statement that captured the heart of her struggle. Her therapist's response was illuminating, being motivated by speed instead of accuracy, by fear rather than intention. That is what will create a life in which maybe you're not alone, but eventually, there might not be much of you at all. This insight revealed the true cost of Emma's pattern. In her rush to avoid solitude, she had been erasing herself bit by bit, accommodating and adapting until her authentic self had nearly disappeared. The path forward wasn't about swearing off relationships forever, it was about learning to be genuinely comfortable in her own company first. This meant confronting the discomfort she had spent decades avoiding. Emma began small. Instead of immediately accepting every social invitation, she started sitting with the initial anxiety of having empty time. She rediscovered her love of running, but this time she didn't abandon it when others showed no interest. She began reading books that interested her, regardless of whether they made good conversation topics. The process wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments when the old panic returned, and she almost called an ex or accepted a date with someone she didn't genuinely like. But gradually, she began to experience something she hadn't felt since that kindergarten playground, contentment in her own company. Research from Harvard psychologist Dr. Matthew Lieberman shows that our brains are naturally wired for social connection. We have what he calls a social brain network that remains active even during rest. This explains why solitude can initially feel uncomfortable. We're working against millions of years of evolutionary programming that equated isolation with danger. However, other research by Dr. Reed Larson demonstrates that people who can tolerate and even enjoy solitude show higher levels of creativity, emotional regulation, and self-knowledge. The key is learning to distinguish between loneliness, a painful feeling of disconnection, and solitude, a chosen state of being alone without feeling lonely. As Emma became more comfortable with solitude, something interesting happened. Her relationships with others began to improve. When she was no longer desperate for company, she could be more selective about whose company she kept. When she wasn't frantically trying to avoid being alone, she could approach social situations with curiosity rather than need. She started saying no to invitations that didn't genuinely interest her. She began pursuing her own hobbies and interests, even when others didn't share them. Most importantly, she stopped using relationships as an escape from herself. The true test came several months later, when her friend texted about setting her up on a blind date. The old Emma would have immediately said yes, grateful for the distraction and possibility of a new relationship to fill the void. But this Emma paused. She sat with the invitation, checking in with herself. Was she interested because she genuinely wanted to meet someone new, or was she acting from the old fear of being alone? Was she ready to enter a relationship as a whole person, or was she still looking for someone to complete her? For the first time in her adult life, Emma had the luxury of choice. She could say yes because she wanted to, not because she was afraid to say no. Emma's story illuminates a paradox of modern life. In our efforts to stay connected, we often disconnect from ourselves. Social media promises to keep us linked to others, but it can also make solitude feel like failure. Dating apps offer endless options for companionship, but they can also turn relationships into a form of entertainment rather than genuine connection. The pressure to constantly engage, to always have plans, to never appear alone can rob us of the very experiences that help us grow as individuals. Solitude isn't just the absence of others, it's the presence of ourselves. Emma quote. Each journey challenges our cultural definitions of success and happiness. We're taught that a full social calendar equals a full life, that being in a relationship is inherently better than being single, that saying yes to everything makes us more interesting people. But Emma discovered that a life lived in constant reaction to the fear of being alone isn't really living at all, it's surviving. True contentment comes, not from never being alone, but from being genuinely okay with your own company. As Emma learned to embrace solitude, her capacity for genuine connection expanded. She became a better friend, because she was no longer desperate for friendship. She became more attractive to potential partners, because she was no longer seeking someone to save her from herself. This reflects what psychologists call interdependent relationships, partnerships between two whole people who choose to be together, rather than codependent relationships between two people who need each other to feel complete. Emma quote. Transformation offers practical guidance for anyone struggling with similar patterns. Start small. If the thought of spending an entire weekend alone feels overwhelming, begin with an hour of solitude, without distraction. No phone, no TV, no music, just you and your thoughts. Practice saying no, not to everything, but to invitations that you're accepting out of fear, rather than genuine interest. Notice the difference between, I want to do this, and I should do this, so I'm not alone. Develop solo activities you genuinely enjoy. Whether it's hiking, reading, cooking, or creating art, having pursuits that fulfill you independently of others builds confidence in your own company. Question your motivations. Before entering a relationship or making social plans, ask yourself, am I doing this because it genuinely excites me, or am I running from solitude? Learning to be alone doesn't mean becoming a hermit or avoiding relationships. It means developing the capacity to be genuinely content in your own company, so that when you do choose to be with others, it comes from a place of abundance, rather than scarcity. Emma's story continues to unfold. She may indeed meet someone special, fall in love, and build a lasting partnership. But now, she'll do so as a complete person choosing to share her life, rather than a fragmented person seeking completion. The text message from her friend still glows on her phone screen, unanswered. But for the first time in her adult life, Emma has the luxury of time to consider what she actually wants, time to listen to her own voice, time to choose from love, rather than fear. In a world that never stops moving, never stops demanding our attention, never stops offering us ways to avoid ourselves, Emma has found something revolutionary: the courage to be still, to be alone, and ultimately, to be herself. The greatest relationship she'll ever have, she's discovering, is the one with the person who's been there all along, herself. And from that foundation, every other relationship becomes not a necessity for survival, but a joyful choice for connection. This sponsor segment was brought to you by the understanding that true learning begins when we stop running from ourselves and start running toward who we're meant to become. In a world full of noise, sometimes the most radical act is simply listening to the silence within.